In the autumn of 1878, in the dust-choked town of Redemption, Wyoming, a girl named Ilara was traded for a stack of gambling debts and a deed to a worthless mineral claim. Her uncle, a man whose promises turned to grit in the mouth, made the bargain over a stained table in the back of the saloon, the scent of stale whiskey sealing the pact more surely than any signature. But what her uncle, and the town that watched with a mix of pity and scorn, didn't know was that this was not an ending. This was not the final tally of a life deemed forfeit before it had truly begun. This is their story, a tale of what the world called worthless, and what a quiet man in the wilderness knew to be more precious than gold. The man's name was Silas. He was not a creature of the town, but of the high, lonely places where the wind spoke a language older than any settlement. He stood by the saloon doors, a silhouette against the brutal afternoon sun, his presence a stark contrast to the shifting, uncertain men inside. His face was a map of seasons, creased by sun and cold, his eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm. He did not look at Ilara as her uncle's property, a piece of chattel to be inventoried. He looked at her hands, clasped tightly in front of her thin calico dress, the knuckles white. He looked at the straight line of her spine, a fragile defiance in a world that sought to break her. Her uncle, smelling of desperation, shoved her forward. Here she is then, strong girl, good for work. The words were a butcher's assessment of livestock. Silas said nothing. His gaze moved from her hands to her face. She was 18, but the hope of that age had been scoured from her expression, leaving behind a quiet, waiting stillness. She did not plead or cry. She simply stood, a vessel for the shame that was not hers to bear, but had been forced upon her all the same. In her arms, she clutched a small cloth-wrapped bundle. It was all she had. The trapper reached into his worn leather pouch and placed a small stack of coins and a folded paper on the saloon's porch rail. He did not count it out with a flourish. The transaction was a grim necessity, and he afforded it no ceremony. Her uncle snatched the payment, his eyes darting away from both the man and the girl, his relief a foul thing to witness. He disappeared back into the shadows of the saloon without a backward glance. The debt was paid. A silence settled. The dust motes danced in the slanted light. The town watched from behind parted curtains and from the doorways of the mercantile and the smithy. They saw a girl sold and a trapper who had bought himself a woman for the winter. They saw what they expected to see. Silas finally spoke, his voice rough, like stones grinding together. Come. It was not a command so much as a statement of fact. The path was set. Ilara followed, her feet stirring small puffs of ochre dust. He led her to a wagon hitched to a sturdy mule at the edge of town. The wagon was loaded with supplies, sacks of flour and beans, tins of coffee, a new axe head. It was the wagon of a man who planned for solitude and survival. He gestured to the wagon seat. She climbed up, her movement stiff, her bundle held tight against her chest. He untied the mule, swung himself up beside her, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the animal moving. They left the town of Redemption behind them. Ilara did not look back. There was nothing there to see. The journey was measured not in miles, but in the slow, rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the shifting of the sun across the vast, indifferent sky. The landscape opened up, swallowing the small track they followed. The prairie grasses were burned to a pale gold, and the horizon was a sharp, blue line broken only by the distant, jagged teeth of the mountains. The scale of it was terrifying. It was a land that could erase a person without a trace. Silas did not speak. The silence he kept was not angry or menacing. It was his natural state, like the stillness of a deep forest. Hours passed. The sun beat down, and the air grew thin and cool as they gained elevation. Ilara felt a thirst so profound it was like a fever. Just as her throat began to feel sealed shut, Silas reached behind him, pulled a water skin from a hook, and passed it to her. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. She drank, the cool water a shock of grace, and handed it back. He took it, secured it, and the silence resumed. Later, he offered her a piece of dried venison. It was tough and salty, but it was sustenance. It was an acknowledgement that she was a living thing, with needs. It was more consideration than her uncle had shown her in a decade. She ate it slowly, tearing off small pieces with her teeth, feeling the strength from it seep into her weary limbs. She was a debt. She was a piece of property. And yet this stranger had given her water and food. The contradiction was a small, sharp point of confusion in the vast emptiness of her despair. She did not understand him. She did not know what he wanted from her, but she knew what men like her uncle wanted. She braced herself for the inevitable. For the moment, his silence would break and his demands would begin. They traveled until the sun bled red and purple across the western peaks, setting the sky ablaze. He pulled the wagon into a small copse of aspens near a trickling creek. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone. He slid from the wagon seat. "We'll make camp here." He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of such tasks. He unhitched the mule, led it to the water, and gave it a measure of oats. He built a fire with the same quiet competence, striking a single spark into a nest of dry tinder. The flames caught, grew, and pushed back the encroaching darkness. Ilara remained on the wagon, watching him. She was an object waiting to be told its purpose. He looked up at her, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "You can get down." She did, her legs stiff. She stood by the fire, a small, lost figure in the immense wilderness. She expected him to give her an order, to tell her to cook, or to set up a bedroll for him. Instead, he handed her a blanket from the wagon. "The nights get cold." He then set about making a simple meal of beans and bacon in a cast-iron skillet. When it was done, he scraped a portion onto a tin plate and handed it to her, along with a fork. He ate his own portion standing by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the gentle murmur of the creek, and the sigh of the wind through the aspen leaves. When she was finished, she did not know what to do with the plate. She held it in her lap, waiting for instruction. After a moment, he took it from her without a word, rinsed it in the creek along with his own, and set them aside to dry. He unrolled 2 bedrolls from the wagon. He placed one for himself near the fire. He placed the other on the far side of the flames, a good 10 feet away with the wagon between them. He looked at her once more. "Rest," he said. And then he turned his back, lay down on his bedroll, and pulled his blanket up to his shoulders. Ilara stood frozen for a long moment. This was not what she had been prepared for. The distance he had placed between them was a chasm. It was a statement. She did not understand it, but she was grateful for it. She walked to the bedroll, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. She lay down, still clutching her small bundle, and pulled the rough wool blanket over her. The fire was warm on her face. The stars overhead were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds, more than she had ever seen. They were cold and beautiful and impossibly far away. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not afraid of the coming night. She was only tired. She closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The sound of a stranger's steady breathing on the other side of the fire, a strange and unexpected lullaby. The next day they traveled again, climbing higher into the foothills. The air grew crisper, the trees thicker. By late afternoon they arrived. The cabin was nestled in a small meadow, surrounded by towering pines, a thin plume of smoke already rising from its stone chimney, likely from a fire he had banked before leaving. It was small, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. It was not a home. It was a shelter, a fortress against the wilderness and the winter that was already whispering in the high passes. A lean dog, a mix of something wolfish and something loyal, came bounding out, barking until it recognized Silas. Then, its tail began a frantic, joyful rhythm. Silas put a hand on the dog's head, murmuring a low greeting. The dog, whose name she would learn was Ghost, then looked at Ilara, sniffed her cautiously, and gave a final, permissive wag. Silas unloaded the supplies from the wagon, moving with the same unhurried efficiency as before. Ilara stood by, uncertain of her role. Finally, he turned to her. "The well is over there," he said, pointing to a stone-lined circle with a simple bucket and rope. "The house has 2 rooms. This one," he gestured to the main room they stood in, which served as kitchen, workshop, and living space. And that one. He pointed to a closed door. That one is yours. Alara stared at the door. A room of her own. She had never had a door that closed, a space that was hers alone. The idea was so foreign it felt like a trick. I need help, he stated, not unkindly. Someone to cook, to mend, tend the chickens, keep the place. He paused, his gaze steady. That is all I need. You'll have your own room, your own space. You do your work, I'll do mine. You will be safe here. The word hung in the air between them. Safe. It was a promise she had stopped believing in. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She went to the door and pushed it open. The room was small, barely big enough for the narrow cot and a small wooden chest. But it had a window, covered by a piece of oiled parchment that let in a soft, milky light. The room was clean. It smelled of pine and soap. It was a haven. She placed her bundle on the cot. Slowly, she unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a worn book, its cover soft with use. Leaves of grass. It had belonged to her mother. It was the only piece of her she had left. She ran her hand over the embossed title, the feel of it a familiar comfort. She set it on the chest, a small anchor of self in this strange new world. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Alara learned the contours of her new life through labor. She rose before dawn, the cabin cold and silent save for the breathing of the man in the other room. She would build up the fire in the hearth, put the coffee on to boil, and make biscuits or oatmeal. Silas would rise with the first light, eat the meal she prepared in his customary silence, and then he would be gone, heading into the vast wilderness with his traps and his rifle, ghost at his heels. He was a man who belonged to the mountains. She was a woman who belonged to the cabin. The space was her domain. She cleaned with a ferocity born of a need for order in a life that had been chaos. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few dishes, mended his torn shirts with tiny, neat stitches. She collected eggs from the small chicken coop, her hands gentle as she lifted the warm, perfect ovals from the nests. She tended the small, hardy garden, her fingers learning the feel of the soil, the satisfaction of pulling a stubborn weed, the small miracle of a frost-nipped carrot. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was a clear accounting. A clean floor was a clean floor. A mended shirt was a mended shirt. A full stew pot was a full stew pot. Her labor had a tangible result, a value she could see and touch. No one could gamble it away. No one could call it worthless. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused. A splinter was a minor annoyance, a burn from the stove a mark of a day's work. She watched her own hands change and felt a strange sense of pride. These were the hands of a person who did things, who made things, who survived. Silas would return at dusk, weary and smelling of pine and cold air. He would bring game, a rabbit, a grouse, sometimes a deer that they would butcher and smoke together. He taught her how to skin an animal with clean, efficient strokes, how to tan a hide until it was soft and supple. He did not praise her, but he would watch her work, a quiet nod his only comment. And in his gaze she saw not judgment but assessment. He was measuring her competence, her grit, and she felt for the first time that she was not being found wanting. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a language of actions. If she left a pail of water by the door, he would use it to wash before supper. If he left a stack of firewood on the porch, she knew a cold snap was coming. He repaired the handle on her favorite cast iron pot. She left a bowl of warm stew on the hearth for him when he returned late. It was a quiet partnership, a delicate dance of shared existence in a world that demanded resilience. But the silence was also a wall. She knew nothing of him, nothing of the life that had etched those lines onto his face. She did not know if he had ever had a family, a wife, a child. There were no pictures, no keepsakes, no ghosts in the corners of the cabin, except for the ones she carried herself. His past was a locked room, and she did not dare to knock. Her own shame was a constant companion. In the quiet moments, when the bread was rising and the cabin was warm, it would whisper to her, "You were bought. You are a transaction. She fought the voice by focusing on her tasks, by losing herself in the rhythm of kneading dough or stitching a seam. She was proving her worth, day by day, meal by meal, chore by chore. But she was proving it to herself. She did not know if it mattered to him at all. To him, she was a pair of hands, a convenience, a debt paid in labor. One evening, a deep cold had settled over the valley. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a mournful, lonely sound. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light and warmth, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Silas was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical. Alara sat on a small stool on the other side of the hearth, her mending in her lap. But she was not sewing. She was reading. She had her book open, the pages illuminated by the flickering firelight. She was lost in the words, the cadence of the poems a balm to the raw parts of her soul. She did not notice him watching her until the silence in the room changed, becoming heavier, more focused. She looked up. He had stopped his work. His hands were still on the rifle, but his eyes were on her book. "What is it?" he asked. The question, so simple and direct, startled her. She felt a flush of embarrassment, as if he had caught her in some frivolous act. It's a book of poems," she said, her voice small. He did not scoff or mock her. He simply nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Poetry." He said the word as if tasting it. "My wife. She liked books." It was the first time he had ever mentioned a wife. The word hung in the air, a sudden, shocking revelation. A ghost had just walked into the room. Alara did not know what to say. She looked down at her book, her heart hammering in her chest. "She died," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Her and the boy. Fever. 10 years ago now." He went back to cleaning his rifle, his movements just as precise as before. But the room was different. The silence was now filled with the weight of his loss. He had not shared a story. He had shared a scar. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a weathered trapper, but a man hollowed out by grief. A man who had built a fortress of solitude around a core of profound pain. She understood then the silence, the distance. It wasn't about her. It was about him. It was the armor he wore to survive. She closed her book and went back to her mending. But she stitched with a new awareness. She was not just a housekeeper in a stranger's cabin. She was a witness to a quiet, solitary grief. And in that shared, fire-lit space, something small and fragile began to shift between them. The wall of silence had not crumbled, but a single stone had been removed, leaving a crack through which a sliver of light could pass. Winter arrived not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a fist. The sky turned the color of lead, and the world disappeared into a maelstrom of white. The wind shrieked, and the snow piled in drifts against the cabin walls, burying them in a silent, frozen world. For days, they were prisoners of the storm. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin. The enforced proximity should have been suffocating. Instead, it was calm. Silas worked on his traps and tanned the hides from his autumn hunt, the sharp, earthy smell filling the room. Alara baked bread, the scent of yeast and warmth, a defiant answer to the cold outside. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, a rhythm born of months of shared space. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through the chinking, a persistent, insidious presence. And it found a weakness in Alara. It started as a tickle in her throat, then a shiver she couldn't shake. By the second day of the storm, she was consumed by fever. The world dissolved into a blur of heat and chills, of disjointed images and whispered sounds. She was burning and freezing at once. She remembered the rough texture of the blankets, the suffocating weight of them. She remembered the taste of snow, cool and sharp on her parched lips. And through it all, there was a constant presence, a shadow moving in the periphery. Silas. He was there when she woke from fevered dreams, her body drenched in sweat. He was there with a cool cloth for her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. His calloused hands, hands that could set a snare or skin a deer, were impossibly tender as he bathed her face and wrists. He coaxed broth between her lips, his voice a low rumble. Just a little. You need the strength. He spoke more to her in those few days than he had in all the months before. They were simple words, words of care and reassurance, but to Alara, they were a revelation. In a moment of lucidity, she opened her eyes and found him sitting in a chair beside her cot, simply watching her. The fire was low, and the room was filled with shadows. His face, in the dim light, was etched with a deep concern. It was a look she had never seen before on anyone's face, directed at her. It was not pity. It was something deeper, something fiercely protective. "You're safe," he said, as if sensing her fear. "Just rest." She succumbed to the fever again, but this time the dreams were not of her uncle or the scornful faces of the town. They were of a quiet, steady presence, a warmth against the killing cold. When the fever finally broke, she woke to a world of profound stillness. The storm had passed. Sunlight, brilliant and white off the new snow, streamed through the small window. She felt weak, scoured out, but the fire in her blood was gone. She was alive. Silas was at the hearth, stirring something in a pot. He heard her stir and turned. He came to her cot, a bowl of thin, savory porridge in his hands. He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. He didn't try to feed her, but sat on the chair and waited while she ate, her hands trembling as she held the spoon. When she was done, he took the bowl. "You were sick," he said simply. "You took care of me," she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He just nodded. He looked at her, his gaze direct. "I bought a housekeeper," he said, his voice even. "I did not buy a ghost." The words settled in her heart. He had not saved a piece of property from breaking. He had saved a person. In that small, snowbound cabin, in the aftermath of the storm, Ilara understood. She was not just a worker here. She was a charge. Someone to be kept safe. The temporary had begun to feel terrifyingly like something else. Something solid. Something that might hold. As her strength returned, a new quiet settled between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who had weathered a storm together. The space between them had changed. It was no longer a chasm, but a shared ground. She began to add small touches to the cabin, things that made it less of a shelter and more of a home. She found a cracked jar and filled it with dried winter grasses. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth until they shone. She took one of the softest deer hides and made a cushion for his chair. Small things. Unspoken things. He noticed. He would come in from the cold and his eyes would scan the room, taking in the small changes. He never commented, but one evening, he sat down in his chair and felt the new cushion beneath him. A slow, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile. The sight was so unexpected it made her heart skip a beat. He began to leave things for her. A perfectly formed pine cone on the table. A bird's feather of an impossible, iridescent blue. One afternoon she found him by the fire, a piece of wood in his hands. He was carving. With a small, sharp knife he was coaxing a shape from the wood. It was a bird, its head cocked, its form so lifelike she could almost hear its song. He worked for hours, the shavings falling around his feet. When he was done, he sanded it smooth with a piece of leather and set it on the mantelpiece. He did not say it was for her. He did not have to. The next day, he carved a fox, then a bear. Soon the mantelpiece held a small, silent menagerie of woodland creatures, each one a testament to the patience and artistry in his rough hands. They were gifts of time, gifts of attention. One evening, as she was washing the dishes, her hands deep in the warm, soapy water, he came and stood beside her. He took the towel and began to dry the plates as she washed them. They worked in tandem, a simple, domestic rhythm. "You have good hands," he said, his voice low. "Strong, capable." She looked down at her hands, no longer the hands of a frightened girl, but the hands of a woman. They were red and chapped from the lye soap and the cold, but they were competent. They could knead bread, stitch a wound, soothe a fever, tend a fire. So do you, she replied, her voice soft but steady. She looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars, at the way they could be both powerful enough to fell a tree and gentle enough to carve a tiny, delicate bird. He stopped drawing the plate he held and looked at her. The air was thick with unspoken words. The distance between them had collapsed into nothing. There was no pretense, no transaction. There were only two people, a man and a woman, standing in the warm light of a cabin that had slowly, imperceptibly become a home. He did not touch her. He did not have to. The look in his eyes was enough. It was a look of profound, quiet reverence. It was a look that saw her, not the debt, not the housekeeper. Her, Ilara. Spring came not as a promise, but as a slow, muddy surrender. The snow melted, swelling the creek to a roar. The earth, frozen for months, softened and released the scent of life. The world turned from white and gray to green and brown. It was a time of rebirth, and something in Ilara felt it was her own. They worked together in the garden, turning the dark, rich soil. Silas's strength made the hard work of breaking the ground easier, while her patient hands planted the tiny seeds in neat rows. They moved as a team, their silence now a comfortable language of shared purpose. They were planting for a future, for a harvest they would share. The idea of permanence, once a terrifying thought, now felt like a quiet hope taking root in her soul. But the world outside their small valley had not forgotten them. Their supplies began to run low. A trip to redemption was unavoidable. The thought of returning to that place, to the stares and the whispers, filled Ilara with a cold dread. She had built a new life, a new self, in the solitude of the mountains. To face the town felt like facing a ghost of the girl she had been, a girl defined by shame. Silas seemed to sense her unease. The morning they were to leave, he stood by the wagon, his face set. "You don't have to go," he said. "I can go alone." She looked at the cabin, at the small garden with its hopeful green shoots, at the dog, Ghost, who sat at her feet with a quiet loyalty. This was her home now. She would not hide from the world. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'm going with you." He nodded once, a look of respect in his eyes. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She was not the same girl who had left this town months ago. The journey down from the mountains was the reverse of their first trip. The world was bursting with life, the aspens leafing out, the prairie grasses greening. But as they neared redemption, the landscape flattened, the dust returned, and the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in Ilara's stomach. The town was as she remembered it, small, mean, and watchful. As they drove down the main street, heads turned. Windows were suddenly occupied. The whispers started, a rustle of judgment that followed them like their own dust cloud. They saw Silas, the hermit trapper. And they saw the girl he had bought, looking healthier, stronger, but still, in their eyes, his property. They conducted their business at the mercantile, the storekeeper's wife looking Ilara up and down with a cold curiosity. Ilara met her gaze and did not flinch. She spoke her list of needs: flour, salt, sugar, seeds, her voice clear and steady. Silas stood beside her, a silent, solid presence. His being there was a shield. As they were loading their supplies into the wagon, a voice, thick with liquor and malice, cut through the air. "Well, well, look what the mountain cat dragged in." Ilara froze. It was her uncle. He stumbled out of the saloon, his face bloated and red, his eyes narrowed with a drunkard's cunning. He looked her over, a sneer twisting his lips. "Gotten plump, haven't you? He's been feeding you well. I'll have to adjust the price for the wear and tear." A few men on the saloon porch snickered. The shame, the old, familiar shame, washed over Ilara, hot and suffocating. She felt herself shrink. But then Silas moved. He did not move aggressively. He simply stepped between Ilara and her uncle, blocking his view. He was taller, broader, a man made of mountain granite next to a man crumbling from rot. "The debt is settled," Silas said, his voice a low growl. The debt for her keep is settled, her uncle spat. But she's still my blood, my property. I've had a better offer for her from a man down in Laramie. A man with real money. He reached out a hand, as if to grab Alara's arm. Silas caught his wrist. His grip was not violent, but it was absolute. The strength in it was terrifying. Her uncle's face went pale. She is not property, Silas said, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. He released her uncle's wrist, and the man stumbled back. Silas reached into his own coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the original bill of sale, but it had been altered. In a neat, careful hand, Silas had written across it. He had turned it into a contract of employment. He had listed her duties, and at the bottom, he had calculated her wages, month by month, and marked them as paid in full by room, board, and protection. He had even added a final line, a severance payment of $20, which he now pulled from his pocket. He held the paper out for the town marshal, who had been drawn by the commotion. "This is a work contract," Silas stated, his voice ringing with authority. "Miss Alara's term of service is complete. She is a free woman. Her wages are paid." He then turned to Alara, holding out the $20. But his eyes were not on the money. They were on her. He was not telling her what to do. He was asking her. It was her choice. The whole town was watching. Her uncle, the marshal, the silent faces in the windows. They were all waiting to see what the purchased girl would do. Alara looked from Silas's steady, waiting face to her uncle's sputtering, incredulous one. She saw her past and her future embodied in the two men. A life of being used and discarded, or a life of quiet dignity and earned respect. She stepped forward, past the protection of Silas's body, and faced her uncle directly. For the first time, she spoke to him not as a frightened niece, but as his equal. "I am not your property," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I have never been. You have no claim on me." Then she turned to Silas. She did not take the money he offered. Instead, she looked him in the eye and said the words that would define the rest of her life. "I am staying." She paused, then added, "I am going home." The marshal looked at the paper, looked at Silas's resolute face, and then at the young woman who stood with a spine of steel. He grunted. "The man's right, Davies. The contract is clear. She's her own person. You move on, or I'll run you in for disturbing the peace." Her uncle, defeated and humiliated, cast one last venomous look at her and shuffled back into the darkness of the saloon. The show was over. The town began to turn away, the whispers now tinged with a grudging respect. Silas folded the money and put it back in his pocket. He looked at Alara, and a slow warmth spread through his eyes. He had not rescued her. He had given her the tools to rescue herself. He had given her standing. He had given her a choice. He gestured to the wagon. "Let's go home," he said. The journey back to the cabin was different. The silence was not one of uncertainty or grief, but of profound, settled peace. Alara sat beside him on the wagon seat, not as a passenger, but as a partner. As they left the dusty plains and began to climb back into the clean air of the foothills, he reached over, his large, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the seat. His touch was warm and firm. It was not a question. It was a statement. "You are mine, and I am yours." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. The years passed as the seasons do in the high country, each with its own beauty and its own challenges. The cabin grew. Silas added a new room, built with the same care and precision as the first. Then another. The garden expanded, its bounty filling a root cellar he dug into the hillside. The small flock of chickens grew, and they added a milk cow and 2 pigs. The shelter became a homestead. The temporary had become permanent. Alara's life had been a transaction. Now it was a testament to the resilience of the human heart, to the quiet power of steadfast love. 10 years after she had first arrived in that valley, a girl of 18 stripped of everything but a book of poems, Alara stood on the porch of their home. She was a woman now, her face fuller, her hands still capable, but her eyes held a deep, abiding peace. The lines of worry had been smoothed away, replaced by the faint creases of laughter. Two children, a boy with his father's steady eyes and a girl with her mother's determined spirit, played in the meadow, their laughter echoing in the clear mountain air. Ghost, old and gray of muzzle now, lay sleeping in a patch of sun at her feet. Silas came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders in a familiar, comfortable gesture. He was older, his hair now more silver than brown, but the years had only deepened the kindness in his face. He followed her gaze to the children, to the thriving homestead that they had built with their own four hands. "It's a good life," he said, his voice softer than it had once been, worn smooth by years of love and quiet conversation. "It is," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, hand-carved box made of aspen wood. He placed it in her palm. It was smooth and warm from his body heat. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft rabbit fur, was a ring. It was not gold or silver, but a simple band of dark, polished iron, inlaid with a tiny, intricate silver star. It was something he had made, a piece of his heart and his skill forged into a circle. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He did not say, "Will you marry me?" They were already married in every way that mattered. Their lives were intertwined, their hearts bound together more tightly than any vow could make them. The ring was not a question. It was a recognition of what already was. A symbol of a promise kept every day for a decade. He lifted her hand, the one with the ring, and held it in both of his. He looked out at the land, at the mountains that stood as silent witnesses to their story. The world had called her a debt, a worthless chit to be traded and forgotten. But this man, this quiet, weathered trapper, had looked at her and seen a queen. He had not given her a crown or a castle. He had given her something far more valuable: a home, a family, a life. He had treated her like royalty, not by placing her on a pedestal, but by standing beside her as an equal, by honoring her strength, and by loving her not for what she could do for him, but for who she was. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. He squeezed her hand gently. She squeezed back. No words were needed. Their life was the poem, and it was beautiful.